Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. What you are about to hear is not a comfortable story, nor is it a polite one. It is a story about assumptions, dangerous ones. It is about what happens when kindness is mistaken for weakness, when dignity is confused with submission, and when a man known for calm restraint is pushed one step too far. What happens when you look at a man defined by his gentle demeanor, his heartfelt love songs, and his unwavering devotion to his wife and 3 daughters, and assume that he is soft? What happens when performative outrage, loud and shrill, attempts to drown out the quiet, steady baseline of deeply held American values? What happens when someone believes that silence means surrender? For years, the media has told us exactly who Tim McGraw is supposed to be. He is the safe country star, the crossover success, the actor who plays devoted fathers and loyal husbands with a tenderness that makes audiences tear up. He is not a firebrand like Jason Aldean. He is not a loud, rowdy jokester like Blake Shelton. Tim McGraw has always been presented as something else entirely, the statesman of country music, a man of sobriety, discipline, faith, and immense dignity. A professional who rarely raises his voice, rarely takes the bait, and almost never courts controversy. But dignity, as Joy Behar was about to discover in the most humiliating way possible, is not the same thing as passivity. Because a man who has maintained a 30-year career at the very top of the charts does not do so by accident. A man who has conquered addiction, rebuilt himself in public view, and raised a family in the spotlight without scandal is not fragile. That kind of life requires discipline, resilience, and a spine forged from titanium. And on one ordinary Wednesday morning at the ABC studios, Joy Behar decided to test that spine. The morning began like any other at The View. The studio lights warmed up, the audience filed in, producers reviewed talking points, everything appeared routine, but behind the scenes there was tension, real tension, the kind you feel before a high-stakes gamble. The producers were nervous. Ratings among Heartland viewers had been bleeding ever since the show's previous confrontations with Blake Shelton and Jason Aldean. Those clashes had gone viral, but not in the way the network had hoped. They hadn't sparked dialogue, they had alienated millions. This time they needed a bridge, they needed a reset, they needed a peace offering. Tim McGraw was supposed to be that offering. He's perfect, one producer reportedly said. He's calm, he's reasonable, he won't blow up. Joy Behar, however, saw something else. She saw an opportunity. She decided that Tim McGraw would be the ideal target for a lecture on toxic masculinity, on traditional values, on what she viewed as outdated cultural norms. She believed he would nod politely. She believed he would apologize for things he never said. She believed he would play the game, smile for the camera, protect his brand, and retreat. She was wrong. What Joy forgot, what many people forget, was that before he was a global superstar, Tim McGraw was a Louisiana boy. A boy raised with a simple code: treat people with respect until they prove they don't deserve it. And when they cross that line, you don't scream, you don't posture, you stand your ground. As the interview began, the tone was pleasant enough. Joy smiled. Tim smiled back. The audience relaxed, but then the questions shifted. Subtly at first, then deliberately, comments about masculinity, jabs at traditional values, implications that his beliefs, and by extension his audience, were part of the problem. Tim listened, calm, still. Measured, Joy mistook that stillness for weakness. Then came the moment that changed everything. Joy crossed the line, not from political debate, but into personal insult. She framed his values as backward. She implied his success came from pandering. She suggested that the kind of man he represented was outdated, even dangerous, and that's when the room changed. Tim didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He didn't perform outrage. He simply responded, quietly, clearly, firmly. He reminded Joy, and everyone watching, that respect goes both ways, that traditional values are not synonymous with hate, that strength does not require shouting, and that dignity does not mean silence in the face of disrespect. The studio fell silent. Joy tried to regain control, but it was already gone. The audience felt it. The producers felt it. For the first time, Joy Behar wasn't directing the moment. She was standing in it. In the shadow of a man who didn't need theatrics to command the room. Backstage, the energy was vibrating. Crew members froze. Segment producers exchanged looks of panic. Social media interns were already watching the clip explode online in real time. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was supposed to be safe, but instead, it became the interview that broke the internet. Clips spread within minutes. Viewers who had never watched The View were suddenly sharing the moment. Headlines wrote themselves. This is the moment the gentle giant stopped being gentle. Tim McGraw didn't storm off. He didn't grandstand. He simply held his ground. And that was enough. Joy Behar, for the first time in a long while, had underestimated her guest. And that mistake would follow her far beyond that studio. And as the segment moved into what television producers often call the third act, the hot topics portion of the show, Joy Behar felt she had found her moment. The first two segments had been largely cordial, carefully scripted to give Tim McGraw the safe, celebrity piece offering treatment. But now, as the conversation shifted toward politics, social issues, and cultural commentary, Joy sensed an opportunity to assert herself, to press the guest, to push him just a little further. The cameras rolled, the audience leaned in, and the air in the studio thickened with anticipation. "So, Tim," Whoopi Goldberg said, expertly steering the conversation toward the intended bridge between celebrity and topical discourse. "We were talking earlier about the state of the country. It feels like we are more divided than ever. You travel everywhere. You see all kinds of people. What are you seeing out there?" The question, on the surface, was a softball. It was gentle, almost perfunctory, a chance for Tim to offer a familiar platitude about unity, about the healing power of music, about the shared human experience. Nothing controversial, nothing that might rattle the morning show routine. Tim McGraw leaned forward slightly, his posture relaxed but attentive. His voice carried the calm, steady warmth that fans had come to love over decades of music and public appearances. "I see good people," he said earnestly. "I see people working hard, loving their families. I think the division is mostly on the screens. You know, when you get down to the ground level, Americans are pretty much the same. We want the same things for our kids. We want to provide, to protect, to love. That's what I see." A murmur of agreement swept through the audience. It was a lovely sentiment, comfortable, familiar, reassuring. But Joy Behar, never one to let an answer go unchallenged, chimed in. Her voice cut through the warm, soft atmosphere like a serrated knife through paper. "But is it true, Tim, or is it just a lyric from one of your songs?" The room shifted. Tim's smile stayed in place, but it no longer reached his eyes. His brow furrowed just slightly, enough to signal to viewers that this was no longer a mere rhetorical question. He turned to look at her directly. He didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. "It's what I see, Joy," he said calmly, with the quiet authority that had carried him through 30 years in the public eye. There was no defensiveness in his tone, but no compromise either. He was asserting his truth, his perspective, firmly and clearly. Joy leaned in undeterred. "Because from where I sit," she continued, "I see a culture war, and frankly, your genre of music is often at the center of it. We see these artists. Now, I won't name names, but we all know who they are. They're promoting guns. They're promoting a certain kind of toxic masculinity. They're promoting a world, that says, if you aren't like us, you're the enemy." The audience quieted. Some leaned forward, anticipating the response. Others looked uneasy, sensing that the soft morning television they expected was about to transform into something far more confrontational. Backstage, the producer in the control room exhaled audibly. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath, a resigned acknowledgement that the carefully balanced show had just tipped into chaos. Tim McGraw's response was calm, measured, and deliberate. "I don't think that's fair," he said, his voice level, steady, and almost hypnotically composed. "Country music is about storytelling. It's about life, the good, the bad, the ugly. It's about real things that happen to real people, but whose reality are we talking about?" Joy didn't hesitate. She pressed, leaning forward even more, her voice sharper, her words slicing through the polite veneer of civility. "Because the reality you sell," she said, "is very specific. It's the truck, it's the beer, the obedient wife, the flag. It's a fantasy of a bygone era, and a lot of people think that fantasy is dangerous because it refuses to accept progress. It refuses to accept that the world has changed. Tim paused. The studio seemed to hold its collective breath. He glanced at Joy, taking in her intensity, her fervor, her belief that she had cornered him in some way. Then he looked at the other hosts, many of whom had their eyes fixed downward on the table, clearly uncomfortable with the heat of the exchange. He assessed them, the audience, the situation, and then spoke. His voice was calm, firm, and unyielding, carrying a subtle, magnetic authority that demanded attention without needing to shout. Joy. He began slowly. I understand what you're saying. I hear it. But what you call a fantasy, I call storytelling. What you see as nostalgia, I see as connecting with people about experiences that matter to them. And yes, those experiences might be different from yours. They might not reflect every perspective, but they reflect real lives, real choices, real families. That's what country music is, storytelling about real life. And it doesn't have to conform to someone else's idea of progress to be valuable or truthful. A hush fell over the studio. The audience shifted in their seats. Even Whoopi and the other co-hosts exchanged glances, unsure how to intervene. The carefully constructed balance of daytime television had cracked, and the fissures were widening with every word. Joy leaned in one last time, her tone almost incredulous. But doesn't that world, she said, that you promote, that your music promotes, send a message about who's included and who's not, about who has power and who doesn't? Isn't it inherently exclusionary? Tim met her gaze evenly. Joy, he said softly, but with unmistakable weight, music doesn't exclude anyone. It reflects the lives people live. Some of those lives are simple, some are complicated, some are traditional, some are progressive, but the point is to tell stories honestly, not to fit them into a political narrative. My goal isn't to divide. My goal isn't to tell anyone what to think. My goal is to make people feel seen, and that doesn't make me outdated. That makes me human. For a moment, the studio was silent. The tension was tangible, almost electric. The audience felt it. The hosts felt it. The crew felt it. What had been intended as a routine Hot Topics segment had become something much larger. A confrontation not just between personalities, but between ideologies, perceptions, and truths. Tim McGraw, the gentle giant of country music, had reminded everyone watching that kindness is not weakness, and dignity is not passivity, and in doing so, he had transformed a predictable interview into a viral, unforgettable moment. I don't think honoring your roots is dangerous, Joy, Tim said softly, his voice carrying a calm authority that filled the space without raising decibels. And I don't think loving your wife is toxic. I think it's necessary. Joy tilted her head slightly, the corners of her mouth tight, her eyes narrowing into a laser focus as she leaned forward. But it's the way it's presented, Tim, she insisted, her words deliberate and measured, yet dripping with accusation. It's this patriarchal idea, the strong, silent father who rules the roost. You play that character in 1883. You live that life in real life. You have 3 daughters. Do you really want them growing up in a world where men are in charge, and women are just expected to look pretty in the passenger seat? The air in the studio seemed to freeze. Every mic, every lens, every person, crew, hosts, and audience alike, collectively inhaled. Joy had committed the cardinal sin of television debate. She had invoked his children. She had crossed a line no interviewer, no critic, no host dared to cross without consequence. Tim's hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, now clasped together. His knuckles whitened slightly. The veins in his forearms became visible under the studio lights, taut with restrained tension. He took a measured breath. My daughters, he said, his voice dropping a notch, deliberate and steady, are the strongest women I know, because they were raised by Faith Hill, and they were raised by a man who taught them that they can do anything, be anything, conquer anything. Joy leaned back slightly, but her eyes never left his. But within the confines of the culture, she interrupted, softening her tone just enough to appear reasonable, while still planting her point. If the culture they live in tells them their value is tied to finding a cowboy husband, are they really free? The words hung in the air, dense with implication. Are they really free? It was an accusation loaded with moral gravity. It suggested that Tim McGraw, the father who had dedicated his entire life to nurturing and empowering his children, was, whether intentionally or not, part of a system keeping them confined, that his world, view, his lifestyle, even his music, was a kind of cage. Tim McGraw stared at Joy Behar, the Hollywood friendly celebrity facade, the charming, approachable star, evaporated in an instant. What remained was a father from Start, Louisiana, a man who had seen his daughters grow into brilliant, independent women. A man who knew the weight of responsibility, the weight of his influence, and had carried it every day. "You think my culture is a cage," Tim said, the words even, measured, not a question, but a statement of intent, of challenge. "I think it can be restrictive," Joy replied, choosing her phrasing carefully, but maintaining her stance. "I think it promotes a version of manhood that can be harmful. We see the violence, we see the anger. Look at the statistics. Angry men, violent men, all glorifying toughness. And you, Tim, you're the godfather of that image. You made the cowboy hat cool again. You bear responsibility for..." Message being sent. Tim leaned back in his chair, his eyes tracing the ceiling for a fraction of a second as he gathered himself. Then he looked back at her, his gaze calm, almost terrifying in its precision. "Responsibility," he said slowly, letting the word roll through the studio like a bell toll. "You want to talk about responsibility?" "Yes," Joy said, her voice steady but sharp. "I do." "Okay," Tim continued, leaning forward slightly, fingers steepled, eyes locked on hers. "Let's talk about it. You sit here every day, Joy. You talk to millions of women. You tell them men are the enemy. You tell them traditional values are a trap. You tell them that being a mother, being a wife, is somehow settling. You tell them the only way to be strong is to be angry. You call that empowerment. I call it resentment." Joy blinked rapidly, leaning forward. "I tell them to be independent." She shot back. "No." Tim corrected her, voice unwavering, each syllable a scalpel. "You tell them to be resentful. I sell love. I sell songs about raising kids, burying grandparents, falling in love, staying in love when it gets hard. You call that fantasy. I call that life. And the reason you hate it, the reason you call it toxic, is because you don't understand it." "I understand it perfectly well." Joy's lips pressed tightly. Her chest rose and fell faster now, the adrenaline coursing through her. "I understand it," she said through gritted teeth. "I understand that it's a tool to keep the patriarchy in power. The patriarchy." Tim laughed, a sound dry, humorless, like the crack of a whip echoing across the studio. "Joy, I live in a house with 4 women. I haven't been in charge since 1996. There is no patriarchy in my house. There is partnership. There is respect. Something you seem to know very little about." The audience collectively gasped. The kind of audible intake that signaled this was no longer just a debate. It was history unfolding. "Oh, snap!" A young woman whispered behind her camera. Joy's face flushed. She was not used to being spoken to like this. She was used to guests who cowered when she threw terms like patriarchy around, who folded under her carefully honed rhetoric. This was different. This was raw. This was Tim McGraw dismantling her arguments with calm precision rather than fear or avoidance. "That is a cheap shot," she said, voice rising slightly. "I'm talking about systemic issues. I'm talking about the message you send to young men. You tell them to be tough. You tell them to be stoic. And that leads to emotional stunting. It leads to violence. Look at the statistics." Tim's voice rose, finally breaking the hushed intensity that had settled over the studio. The power in his lungs filled the room effortlessly, carrying the authority of a man who had been tested, forged, and measured by life itself. "You think being tough is a bad thing. You think being stoic is a defect. Joy, let me tell you something. When the world falls apart, and it does fall apart, you don't want a man who crumbles. You want a man who stands in the storm and doesn't break. You want a man who can hold his family together when everything else is burning down. That is an archaic idea." Joy yelled. "We have therapy now. We have feelings. Men should be allowed to cry." Tim didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his voice intense, eyes piercing hers. "Men do cry. I cry. I cried when my daughters graduated. I cried when I walked them down the aisle. But I didn't cry because I was weak. I cried because I was proud. And I earned those tears." He pointed a finger directly at her, steady and unwavering. You want to strip men of their strength. Tim said, voice resonating like a drumbeat across the studio. You want to turn them into something fragile. You want to erase what makes them able to protect, to lead, to love fiercely under pressure. Strength is not a crime, Joy. It is a gift, and one that must be nurtured, not dismantled. The room was electric. Every camera lens captured the tension. Every microphone picked up the clash of ideologies. Every heart in the audience seemed to pound in time with the verbal duel unfolding at the table. The confrontation had moved far beyond entertainment. It had become a lesson, a reckoning, a philosophical sparring match that would be talked about for weeks, if not months, after the cameras stopped rolling. And still, Tim McGraw sat there, calm, resolute, a man comfortable in his convictions, as Joy Behar stared him down, coiled like a spring, ready to strike at the first perceived weakness, but finding none. The debate was far from over. You want us to sit here and apologize for being men? Tim asked, his voice low, steady, resonant with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years, measured in both public acclaim and private responsibility. Well, I'm not apologizing, not to you, not to anyone. The words hung in the studio air like a thunderclap, cutting through the hum of lights, cameras, and murmurs from the production crew. It was a simple sentence, but in that charged moment it carried the weight of decades of cultural tension, gendered assumptions, and personal conviction. Joy's eyes flared, triumph lighting up her features as she leaned forward, chest rising with the fire of moral certainty. "So you admit it?" she exclaimed, her voice rising to a pitch that betrayed her excitement. "You admit that you are promoting this cowboy archetype that refuses to evolve?" Tim's gaze didn't waver. He remained seated, his hands clasped lightly in front of him, yet every line of his body radiated the restrained tension of a man who had faced worse storms than this. "Evolve into what?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with a challenge. "Into you?" The studio fell silent. The audience, the crew, even the other hosts at the table, all of them froze mid-action. The question was simple, almost innocuous if spoken in another context. But here, in the charged atmosphere of live television, it cut to the bone. "Into a person who judges people they've never met." Joy fired back, relentless, leaning toward him, her pen tapping furiously against her cue cards as if punctuating each accusation with physical force. Tim didn't flinch, his eyes narrowed, a steeliness creeping into the warmth of his gaze. "Into a person who mocks faith," he continued, his voice steady, each word deliberate. "Into a person who thinks that anyone who doesn't live in a penthouse is backward. If that is evolution, Joy, then I'll gladly stay a dinosaur." Joy sputtered, momentarily caught off guard. She turned to glance at Whoopi, as if seeking validation, then scanned the audience. Some were leaning forward in fascination, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure which side to mentally take in the escalating debate. She looked down at her cue cards, flipping them in frustration. Her moral high ground, the one she had carefully cultivated over decades, was slipping through her fingers. She had tried to frame Tim as the villain, the relic of an outdated cultural archetype. And yet, with a few deliberate sentences, he had framed her as a snob, a moralizing judge who assumed superiority over those she did not know. "You are twisting my words," Joy exclaimed, her voice shaking high, pitched with the unmistakable tremor of anger. "This is exactly the problem. You use this shucks charm to hide a very dangerous ideology. You are normalizing intolerance." Tim leaned back slightly, a subtle movement, but his eyes remained locked on hers. "Intolerance?" he asked, his tone measured, incredulous, almost pitying. "Who is the one judging here? I came here to play a song. You came here to pick a fight." He gestured broadly with his hands, the motion fluid but commanding. "I respect your right to have an opinion, Joy, even a wrong one, but you don't respect mine. You don't respect the millions of people who buy my records. You think they are stupid." "I never said they were stupid." Joy snapped, the tremor in her hands betraying her fury. "You called them backward," Tim countered evenly. "You called their lives a fantasy. You told them that their fathers are toxic. That is intolerance, Joy. That is bigotry. Wrapped in a designer suit, perhaps, but it is still bigotry." Joy leaned forward, her entire body bristling with indignation. I am trying to save women from a culture that oppresses them, she shouted, voice rising with righteous anger. I am trying to save them from... Tim rose from his chair before she could finish her sentence. The movement was sudden yet graceful, fluid, the kind of movement that spoke of confidence honed by decades of discipline and physical training. In a single motion, 6 feet of coiled muscle and moral conviction rose to full height, his presence instantly commanding the entire studio. He did not look aggressive, he did not look hostile, he looked protective, like a father who had caught a wolf at the edge of his yard, assessing the threat calmly, ready to defend those in his care. My wife doesn't need saving, he said firmly, his eyes piercing into hers, unwavering. My daughters don't need saving, and the women in the crowds at my shows, they don't need saving either. They are happy, they are loved, they are free. Joy's voice rose even higher, the carefully modulated veneer of professionalism shattering. They are brainwashed, she screamed, losing all semblance of control. The audience murmured, a ripple of audible shock spreading across the room. The production crew exchanged tense glances. Even the other hosts looked frozen, unsure how to intervene in a confrontation that had escalated far beyond typical daytime TV boundaries. Tim's eyes swept across the audience. He saw the shock, the surprise, the curiosity in their expressions. His lips pressed together, then parted, his voice calm but filled with controlled power. Brainwashed, he repeated, slower this time, letting the words sink in. You really believe that, don't you? You really believe that anyone who chooses a simple life, a faithful life, a traditional life must be brainwashed? His tone was not mocking. It was measured, tinged with profound disappointment, almost like a teacher speaking to a student on the verge of misunderstanding a fundamental truth. You really believe that? He said again, softer now, that people who embrace family, love, and commitment as their core values are somehow victims of oppression, that the choices they make voluntarily, choices made with care, with intention, are signs of weakness or indoctrination. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but the force of his presence, the clarity of his conviction, held the room in suspense. Every camera lens recorded it. Every microphone captured it. Every heartbeat in the studio seemed to sync with the tension between them. Tim's gaze returned fully to her, unflinching. I live my life with honesty. I raise my children with respect. I love my wife openly. I tell stories through my music that reflect real life, the challenges, the love, the grief, the joy, and you call it toxic, you call it oppressive, but I see it as freedom, freedom of choice, freedom to love. Freedom to be who you are, unafraid, unashamed, and unmanipulated by cultural resentment. The audience leaned forward. The weight of the words, the gravity of the confrontation, filled the room more completely than any applause or production flourish could. For a moment, television itself seemed secondary to the moral debate unfolding in real time. Joy Behar stared at him, her mind racing, the argument she had rehearsed unraveling under the precision and conviction of his responses. Tim McGraw remained standing, calm, measured, authoritative, a man entirely certain of his truth, prepared to defend it against accusations, assumptions, and moral grandstanding. The debate had transformed. It was no longer about celebrity or ratings. It was about values, culture, and the deep philosophical questions of freedom, responsibility, and the meaning of strength in the modern world. And Tim McGraw, 6 feet of disciplined resolve and paternal authority, had claimed the floor. Joy Behar had thrown the first ideological punch, and now she was facing a response forged in a lifetime of lived experience, careful reflection, and unshakable conviction. The cameras kept rolling. The microphones captured every word. The audience sat rapt, uncertain, captivated, witnessing something far beyond scripted television, watching a real, uncompromising clash of perspectives, raw, personal, and utterly human. The confrontation was far from over, but the stakes had already shifted irreversibly.